As we all know, Donald Trump is the winner of the US presidential election, and he's already making headlines with a bold promise, ending the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. But how does he plan to achieve this, and why is he so focused on it? In today's video, we'll explore Trump's motivations, the details of his proposed peace plan, and how he might manage to bring Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin to the negotiation table. So, stay tuned as we break down the elements, challenges, and global implications of Trump's peace proposal. Donald Trump's determination to end the war in Ukraine stems from both political strategy and deeper geostrategic concerns. As a self-proclaimed isolationist, Trump's foreign policy doctrine has often focused on minimizing U.S. involvement in overseas conflicts. This America First approach appeals strongly to his political base, which has grown increasingly skeptical of extensive foreign aid. According to recent polls, support for Ukraine has notably waned among Republicans. In December 2023, 48% of Republicans believed the U.S. was providing too much support to Ukraine, and that figure has likely climbed since then. This sentiment provides Trump with a powerful talking point. Bringing troops and funds back home aligns with his promise of prioritizing domestic issues. However, Trump's motives go beyond electoral politics. His strategic view, as echoed by allies like former national security chiefs, involves assessing the broader geopolitical landscape. The war in Ukraine has been dragging on with little significant progress on the battlefield. Prolonged conflict risks cementing an increasingly united alliance between adversarial powers, including Russia, China, Iran, and even North Korea. The recent defense cooperation between Russia and North Korea, which reportedly included the deployment of over 10,000 North Korean troops to Russia, indicates the level of deepening ties among U.S. rivals. Another major factor driving Trump's urgency to resolve the war is the U.S. military's current capacity and resource management. The United States has supplied over $70 billion in military aid to Ukraine, which has substantially strained its weapons stockpiles. Experts, including former Trump advisor Elbridge Colby, warn that replenishing these supplies will take years. This poses a critical risk as tensions over Taiwan escalate. The RAND Corporation has projected that in a potential conflict with China, the U.S. could deplete its ammunition stockpiles within 3 to 4 weeks. This alarming scenario underscores Trump's assertion that preserving military resources for a potential showdown with China should be a higher priority than prolonging a stalemate in Eastern Europe. Moreover, America's defense supply chain has vulnerabilities due to dependencies on adversaries like China and Russia for certain components, placing the U.S. industrial base in a precarious position. For Trump, addressing these concerns means shifting focus away from Ukraine and reinforcing U.S. preparedness for broader, potentially more consequential conflicts. Trump's stance resonates with isolationist and realist foreign policy experts who argue that U.S. strategic interests are better served by reallocating resources to deter China and stabilize American military strength. While Trump himself has been relatively guarded about the details, his advisors and allies have shared insights that help outline his strategy. Central to Trump's vision are two major elements: a ceasefire along current battle lines and the establishment of Ukrainian neutrality, both of which are contentious and fraught with potential obstacles. At the core of Trump's plan is an immediate ceasefire that would freeze the conflict along the existing front lines, which span approximately 1,300 kilometers. The idea would be to solidify these positions into a formal demilitarized zone, DMZ. Drawing inspiration from the Korean Peninsula, where a 4-kilometer-wide DMZ has maintained an uneasy peace for decades, Trump's proposed zone would aim to create a buffer between Ukrainian and Russian forces, effectively halting combat and stabilizing the region. This concept, however, implies significant territorial concessions by Ukraine. Current front lines include territories that Russia has controlled since its annexation of Crimea in 2014 and areas seized in the recent stages of the war. These regions account for approximately 20% of Ukraine's land, including parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts. For Ukraine, which has repeatedly emphasized its goal of reclaiming all occupied territories, this is a difficult pill to swallow. Trump and his advisors argue that these concessions are necessary for a long-term ceasefire and, potentially, peace. His former vice president, J.D. Vance, has outlined that such a freeze could pave the way for a formal demilitarized zone monitored by international peacekeeping forces. The idea is to avoid the kind of open-ended conflict that has left regions like eastern Ukraine locked in years of violence and instability. A key part of Trump's plan also involves Ukraine adopting a position of neutrality, particularly regarding NATO membership. Trump and some of his allies argue that Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO have long been a flashpoint for Russian aggression. By pausing or indefinitely delaying NATO accession, Trump believes Ukraine could exist in a neutral state that eases tensions with Moscow and reduces the risk of a wider war. Trump's perspective aligns with that of various international analysts who assert that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe has exacerbated relations with Russia over the past few decades. Even influential figures such as Henry Kissinger have previously argued that Ukraine should act as a bridge between East and West, rather than a frontline state in a standoff between NATO and Russia. For Trump, pressing Ukraine to forego NATO membership would be a significant move to placate Russian security concerns and entice Putin to the negotiating table. Trump's peace plan would likely include international enforcement mechanisms to ensure that both Ukraine and Russia adhere to the ceasefire terms. While he has been critical of U.S. over-involvement in foreign conflicts, Trump's past rhetoric indicates he would expect European nations to take on a larger role. He has long expressed dissatisfaction with NATO's European members for what he perceives as insufficient defense spending and commitment to shared security. Under Trump's plan, it's plausible that European-led peacekeeping forces could be deployed to maintain the demilitarized zone, with financial and logistical support from those same European countries. This strategy plays into Trump's broader vision of shifting more responsibility for regional security to European nations. In his first term, Trump frequently criticized allies for underfunding their defense budgets, arguing that the U.S. disproportionately shouldered the burden. In this new scenario, Europe would have to step up to enforce peace, funding missions and contributing troops to maintain stability in Ukraine. To push Ukraine toward agreeing to this plan, Trump would likely use U.S. military and economic aid as leverage. Since the beginning of the war, the U.S. has provided over $70 billion in military support, a figure that is difficult to sustain indefinitely. Trump has hinted that he would threaten to curtail or significantly reduce this aid if Ukraine resists negotiations, pressuring Kyiv to come to the table. This is a high-stakes strategy. While it might expedite talks, it could also weaken Ukraine's resolve or lead to internal political upheaval. On the Russian side, Trump might take a dual approach. While he has historically shown a willingness to apply pressure, including sanctions and military actions against Russian interests, he could offer economic incentives for peace. This might involve easing certain sanctions or proposing new trade agreements to entice Russian cooperation. However, this approach risks significant pushback, both domestically and from U.S. allies who favor maintaining a hard line against Moscow. The risks of Trump's approach are substantial. Freezing the current front lines may lock in Russian territorial gains and send a signal to other authoritarian regimes that aggression can lead to strategic rewards. Additionally, a policy of Ukrainian neutrality could fuel criticism that the U.S. is abandoning its commitment to democracy and self-determination in Eastern Europe. Critics also point out that while Trump was known for tough rhetoric, his tendency for unpredictable policy shifts could complicate any long-term enforcement of peace terms. Trump's plan, though aiming to end the war swiftly, involves complex compromises and significant shifts in policy. Whether it could genuinely achieve peace or sow the seeds of future conflict remains an open and fiercely debated question. Trump's plan to broker peace in Ukraine faces formidable challenges that raise doubts about its feasibility. While the idea of securing a rapid end to the conflict has appeal, the complexities of diplomatic negotiations and geopolitical realities pose significant hurdles. For one, achieving a ceasefire and freezing current battle lines would mean asking Ukraine to accept the loss of around 20% of its territory. This is a major sticking point, President Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukrainian leaders have maintained a steadfast commitment to reclaiming all occupied land, including Crimea. Agreeing to such concessions could spark backlash both domestically and among Ukraine's international supporters, potentially destabilizing Zelensky's government. A ceasefire that leaves large swaths of Ukrainian territory under Russian control could be seen as legitimizing Russia's territorial gains and embolden other aggressive states. Critics argue this approach risks setting a precedent that might encourage future land grabs. For Ukraine's allies in Europe and beyond, maintaining a strong stance against Russian expansionism is not just about Ukraine but about upholding international norms. Any sign of appeasement might damage credibility and embolden similar moves elsewhere, particularly in regions where US and NATO interests are at stake. The challenge of ensuring Ukrainian neutrality also faces deep skepticism. Neutrality would involve legally binding guarantees, which Ukraine might perceive as compromising its sovereignty. Such guarantees might lack credibility if not backed by NATO or US enforcement mechanisms, which in turn raises questions about long-term security for Ukraine. Moreover, Kyiv's leadership has pointed out that its NATO aspirations are based on the need for collective defense against future Russian aggression. Pausing or delaying these aspirations, as proposed by Trump, could be seen as sacrificing Ukraine's right to choose its security alliances. Another significant hurdle is convincing Russia to agree to terms that fall short of its broader strategic ambitions. While Russia would benefit from holding on to key territories and gaining assurance that Ukraine won't join NATO, the Kremlin's ultimate goals have been more extensive. President Vladimir Putin's maximalist objectives, as outlined in previous policy statements and military actions, include the complete annexation of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts. A ceasefire based on current lines, especially one involving a demilitarized zone, may not satisfy these ambitions. Recent statements from the Kremlin dismissing the idea of a rapid peace agreement as fantasy suggest Russia is not eager to accept half measures. The geopolitical ramifications also pose a challenge. Trump's strategy hinges on leveraging US aid to pressure Ukraine into talks. However, dramatically reducing or ending aid would come with its own risks. It could not only jeopardize Ukraine's defensive capability but also send mixed messages to US allies who rely on American military support. The fear among European nations is that Trump's America First approach might erode US leadership and weaken collective security arrangements in the region. The European response to Trump's plan to end the war in Ukraine would likely be complex and divided. For many European leaders, the war in Ukraine represents a critical test of Europe's commitment to defending sovereignty and democratic values. The idea of a peace plan that involves freezing current battle lines and potentially conceding significant Ukrainian territory could trigger sharp disagreements within the European Union and NATO. Countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and others near Russia's borders may view Trump's approach as dangerously conciliatory. These nations have long perceived Russia as an existential threat, and they could argue that accepting a ceasefire along current lines would embolden Moscow and destabilize the region further. In contrast, countries such as Hungary, which has often shown a more pragmatic or even sympathetic stance toward Russia under Viktor Orban, might be more supportive of Trump's initiative, viewing it as a way to restore stability. Globally, Trump's plan could shift the dynamics between major powers. A peace deal that favors Russian territorial gains might strengthen ties between Moscow, Beijing, and other US adversaries by demonstrating Western acquiescence. It could also weaken the transatlantic alliance by creating a rift between European nations more committed to Ukraine's full territorial integrity and those leaning toward a more cautious approach. The implications for US global leadership are significant. Trump's America First stance, if accompanied by reduced engagement in European security, could lead allies to question US commitment to NATO's collective defense principles. Such a pivot might push European countries to accelerate their defense independence, reshaping the continent's strategic framework and potentially leading to more fragmentation in how the West responds to future global conflicts. Thank you for watching until the end. If you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content on global politics and major geopolitical developments.